Hey everyone, this is Ellie Mae with Swift Creek Customs, and in today's video I'm going to share my testing and tips for working with leather with the Siser EasyCrease tool and the Siser Juliet or Romeo. This will work for either machine. And I have a couple things to share with you before we even get started. So here is a look at the projects that I completed for this video in all of my testing. Now this video is going to be a longer version of the video because I am not only going to talk to you, I don't want to just talk to you, I want to show you the things that I did and the tips and tricks I learned along the way that will help you to be more successful in your projects. First, I would say this is not a beginner out of the box project. If you attempt it, unless you have previous experience with working with both leather and a professional style cutting machine, you are going to end up frustrated and probably go through more leather than you really want to. So hopefully with my tips, when you do get started with this project, it's going to save you some materials. Now, second, leather is a natural product. Even after it's been processed, it is still a natural product. That means that there are flaws. There can be blemishes in it. All leather differs. The main part of this video is going to be covering tooling leather, which I've had the best success with. I will have a section at the very end for processed leather, which is more difficult to work with when you're working with cutting machines, simply because the processing adds things to the leather and makes it tougher, or it's not going to take on a design as easily. But the biggest factor is that every single piece of leather varies. It is not a manufactured product that can be replicated the same every single time. So even when you are measuring your leather, you're going to want to measure every single piece, and even within that leather, that it can have a variance in the thickness. Next, all of the products that I am using or testing with are linked in the description below, as well as additional information that can help you along the way, such as using the camera to set your point of origin and different things that I'll mention through the video. So everything, check out that description. I will break the supply list out into, try to break it out into things that if you're just getting started, here's what you really need to have on hand, as well as if you want to take it farther. When you're working with tooling leather, you are going to be responsible for the processing part of it at the end, adding stain, finishing that, conditioning it, sealing it, all of those things. So that does require additional tools. So it just really depends on how much you want to get into this process, but I will break that down. It'll all be linked in the description below. And finally, before we get started, make sure to like, subscribe, click that bell for notifications, and give a thumbs up so that YouTube will continue to show the videos that I am sharing with the Siser Juliet, Siser Romeo, and Siser Leonardo Design Studio software to more users and help spread the word and get these in front of more people. I greatly appreciate that, and I greatly appreciate the support that I have in my community. Thank you so much. So let's take a look and get started on this video. So here's a look at the finished product after I have done all the stain and everything. And then this is a look straight off the machine. You can still see that some of my leather is wet. With tooling leather, you're going to need to wet it, dampen it, not soak it. So you want to use something to hold that material on your cutting mat and not get fibers on your cutting mat. So I tried transfer tape first. It did not work. It did not do a good enough job, as we'll see here, but I wanted to leave this in the video. Next, I'm using a popsicle stick or a craft stick in order to set my blade, and I needed to support my cutting mat because you want your cutting mat completely flat, rolling through your machine the entire time. So I used the popsicle stick to set the blade depth, and then as I was doing my design, my leather dried out and it started to lift from the transfer tape. The transfer tape adhesive repels the water, and it did not work very well. I still went ahead with my first test, and this is the design. I used the line fills to fill this design as we'll see here in my next test. The first one I sent with just the outline to see how it was going to do and test my force. So there's a look at the first design that I did. And then I continued to test with different line fills to see what I liked the best. And what I concluded was I liked the straight line with a 0.004 spacing. You can see that there is variance in my leather in the top right. There is a blemish there. Next, I used Protecto film. I will link that below. I had to purchase it in a large roll. I will use that because I'll go through more leather projects than the average person. I put that on my mat. It holds it better and it does not repel the water, so it doesn't come up as easily. You may still need painter's tape to hold it in place. So I am just setting that. I realized here something was wrong. I could not go forward with this. And what I realized is that the roller, even though my middle roller is disengaged, the roller was interfering with where I had my leather placed. It was actually hitting on the actual housing of the roller, and I had a roller mark. When I went back to my previous project, I saw it as well, but it worked the day before. These are the fibers. This is why you want to protect your mat. And I would recommend a new sheet of Protecto film each time you go to do this, just to cover underneath where your leather is. So I had to set this back up because of those fibers. If I tried to reuse that sheet in the same place, it's not going to work as well, just from my experience working with leather with cutting machines. So I reset the blade depth with the craft stick, popsicle stick, because every piece of leather can vary. Here is the next design that I sent after I did my initial test. It's a bookmark that I did a fill with. And here the machine is in action. All of your fills, depending on your fill, it's going to take time. I did set this up to cut with a blade. So I'm measuring the blade depth next to the leather. I knew going into this that it was not going to cut through it, and if I tried to, it was going to have issues. The blade will just drag on thicker materials because most times it can't even get up on the material in order to cut through. So I set this blade depth. I actually had to clean my blade since I was using a new 60-degree blade. I had to clean the housing out because I last used it for chipboard, which had a lot of fibers inside of it. So since I was resetting the blade depth anyhow, I might as well clean out the blade, and I'll link a video for that in the description below. So I'm setting up my blade depth, and I'm going to show you the results that I had. I just have very little blade tip out. And then I sent this to just barely cut through the top surface. So testing with tooling leather. This is a veg tan tooling leather. It's pretty thin. This is still pretty, it's a thick, it's thin for leather. You can get it thinner than this, but then you risk tearing it when you go to tool on it or work with it. So cutting through it is going to be very difficult because of the thickness. And I've already pointed out I didn't know it yesterday, but the roller marks. And when I went to do this next piece here, I can go ahead. I'm actually going to take the blade out because I'll show you it did drag. So I was using, you can't even see this tip of the blade. All I did was score it so that I would be able to cut it with scissors and knew where to cut the bookmark. You're going to need a pair of really sharp scissors, and I'll link below the supplies that I am using for all of this and testing with it. I have worked with leather with several cutting machines for years, so I do have the supplies on hand. But I'm going to go ahead and unload this and we'll take a look at it. So I knew when I started, here's that roller mark, and it actually got caught in the machine and it would not move. So I ended up having to adjust that. So you want to make sure that your material is between the rollers, and it can't even be underneath here, because this is where it got stuck, was under the roller housing. So here is the emboss or the deboss, and it does have a texture. Hopefully that'll come through on the camera. It's going to depend with tooling leather and with working with leather. You wet the leather. You don't you dampen it, you don't soak it. But depending on how much water is absorbed can lead to different effects on the emboss. But you also need to keep in mind that leather is a natural resource. That means that just like wood, there are natural variances in it. What I mean by that is, for instance, here, leather is a natural hide, and there can be defects and different things within that leather that can show up. For instance, some of these lines that you see in this design I tested originally can be because of the differences in this natural product. So we have some different texture here, and then I just did embossed the circle so I know where to punch that out with my leather hole punch. And then you can see here, even with this teeny tiny blade sticking out, I still had drag back to my point of origin. But since my design was finished and complete and it didn't end over here, it was okay because it did not drag through my design. So in this case, the project is not lost because I can cut this drag mark off. So I'm just going to wet this down a little bit so you can see the design really pop out and see how that looks. So I am going to make more. This is pretty cool and by far one of the best debosses or tooling with leather so far that I've seen with a cutting machine. There are going to be limits though. Your thickness on your leather, you're not going to be able to cut through the leather. And when I go to cut this, let me just remove this and I'll show you. Now these scissors I have here on hand are probably not, these are just my general scissors. They're not my scissors that I would typically use. I think my scissors are in my leather box. But sharp pair of scissors. I really like these Westcott titanium, and I will link those in the description below. Once you use them for leather, do not use them for anything else. Otherwise it will dull it. And then when you go to cut leather, it may be more difficult. This just barely broke the surface of the leather. I would love if it would be able to cut deeper, but the way the blade is installed correctly with the lock above the housing, you don't have the clearance. So we're going to work with what we have. And I'm just going to cut along. If you bend it there, you can kind of get that to break away, and then you just cut around the edge of the leather. And I'll share my finished test projects and any further tips that I get along the way. Now, the thing with testing any new project or new material is you want to keep as many things, as many factors the same as you continue to test. Because if something goes wrong, then you don't know exactly what the problem is. Here, I got a little bit ahead of myself and I started with a pretty complex design. I thought I had it, but I ended up realizing that I didn't have a big enough piece of leather. So I actually, this was going to take quite a bit of time, and I ended up stopping this job when I realized that it went off of the leather. So this is going to be, I'm going to have to cut that piece off and I can use it for another project. So then I just continued to start again. And I went back to a more simplistic project. I know that it can be done and it will be done in the future, but I just wanted to continue to have some successful projects to be able to share those. So I once again set up my project with the leather. I did another bookmark. This time I did kind of a faux stitching around the edge to see how that was going to work. Now with the EasyCrease tool, it can break the surface, but in this case, most of the times it didn't actually break the surface of the leather. I think you might be able to do that with the Easy Etch tool, but that might tear up your leather too much. I will test with that and have another video out about it. But I really do like this deboss, or you can call it tooling if you want. It's going to be called a lot of different things in the industry depending on who you are. So I sent that. I had the design to deboss with those line fills, and then I had it go around the outer edge with a faux stitching. I ended up doing 2 passes on that just to see how it was going to do. Now with finishing your leather, your gel or your stain, the more it is absorbed, it'll change the colors. So if you do break the surface, it will add more darker colors to that because it's actually getting into the leather. So I did set it up to cut around it. And then I did another design with a key fob that I have created myself that I have used on projects in the past with the Silhouette Curio. So I was able to just use that. And then I continued. These are blanks I ordered off Amazon. Everything's linked in the description below. They are smaller, and this is one of the reasons I say this is not a beginner project, because you're going to want to know exactly where your machine is going to do the process. So I'm using the camera, since these are very small blanks, using the camera to set my point of origin, so then I know it's going to center on my blank. And I sent this, and I had that piece of Protecto film on there. So I just ended up using 9 out of the 10 blanks that I had and continued to test this. I tested with different line fills. I continued testing just to see if it would be different, because this little tag is thicker than the previous leather I was using. So every single piece of leather that you use or you test with could be different. It is so fun. I love it. But unless you are willing to put the time into it, it's not going to be for everybody. So you're going to, I would suggest starting with some pre-made blanks. And I'm going to take a look here. I did wet the different materials each time before I took a photo, just because it makes it pop. Here are the fibers. You can see those. That camera picks up those fibers. And that is how I set the point of origin. Here's another look at another tag. This one here, I ended up at the end, you'll see in the finished photos, you need to be aware of where your finishing hardware is going to end up. And I was not doing that. You don't want to fill the entire space of those little tags, which I realized after the fact. So now here is a look at the finishing process I went through. With the bookmarks and the key fob, I just took my really sharp pair of scissors. I got a new pair. And because I couldn't find my leather scissors, and then I found them later. Yeah, once you buy something new, that's when you find the thing you're missing. So I just bend that leather, wet your leather. That's how it is going to mold. It's how it's going to cut a little bit easier. But also keep in mind that if you have a problem cutting materials by hand, your cutting machine is probably going to struggle too. So think about that when you're testing materials and different things that you're working with your machine. But it gives me a place to start, and it's handmade, handcrafted. It's all going to have variances in here. So I'm wetting the leather down on the edges, and then that's a burnishing tool. So it's going to smooth out and mold that edge of the leather for the cut. And I've learned from other leather crafters. I am no expert as far as finishing leather, as you will probably see in this video. I just follow some of the instructions that I've seen online at different classes with Tandy leather, different things like that. So I just kind of do what I enjoy doing. My dad was a leather crafter, so I've picked up tips from him as well. He's done the hand tooling. So I wanted to keep this in here. It is a process. It's really cool, and it can be a really neat gift idea or for yourself. Once I started doing the initial tags, I had to do them for my whole family, because of course you can't just make one for one person and not the other. So I have all of this. I have a silicone mat protecting my workspace for the next steps. Now I wanted to test my different leather gel stains, because like I said, I have these products from teaching with the Silhouette Curio from years ago when I did an event. So between myself and my husband, I have all of the materials on hand, and it's great that I can once again get into leather projects and do this. So gloves to protect your hands. It is stain, and you don't want to get that. So I'm just testing out what color do I want all of these to be stained with. And again, I'm not an expert. Obviously this bottle I had never opened. Not an expert in finishing the leather. I just keep trying. And that's one of the biggest things. When you're trying new projects, just keep trying. It's not always a failure. It's a learning experience. And I may not do it exactly perfect every single time, but I learn something each time I do. So I'm just testing what color I want to put on that. And so you're going to wet your leather and then you apply your gel so it's going to be absorbed, and then you can wipe off any excess that you have. The more you apply, the more that's soaked in, the darker it can be. And the more depth that your deboss or tooling has on your material, that can affect the colors and the color variance. Again, leather, natural product, it does have variance in it, so that's also going to affect how it stains or the final finish on that stain too. If you have a blemish in your leather that you have in your product, it can actually give it a very unique look, so it's not always a bad thing. So now I chose the one I wanted. I'm just going to apply the stain to the fronts and also on the sides to start with. So I'm just using a dauber there and applying it all over the project. And then once I was done with that, I closed the bottle because of course I'm accident prone and I don't want to spill that everywhere. And then I took a clean cotton cloth that I had. Old t-shirts work great for this, and just wiped it off. You don't want anything that has any fibers that's going to leave, debris or anything on your, within your stain. And then I just continued wet the leather for all of these. And depending on the leather you have, some can be drier than others and may need more water. Over time, you're going to just want to test with that and play with that. And then I just continued to add stain to the fronts. And this is a process. So this, you have to let the stain dry before you can seal it. You can see here, I'm cleaning everything up. I was trying to decide, am I going to stain the backs? That is a personal preference. If you want it to, it depends on what color stain you have on whether it's going to stand out or not. You do want to get the sides just so everything kind of matches. And then, do you want a second coat of stain on the front of it? And that is completely personal preference in what you do. On one of the bookmarks, I ended up doing 2 coats, and on another one, I left it without. So you're going to see in the finished photos, they do have a different look. And I just continued to finish out these projects here. Now here's a look after they were all stained. I was letting them sit to dry. And then I let them dry overnight. It might have been a day or two before I actually got back to the finishing part. I was really looking for some leather for the bookmarks to finish those out. You could also use those bookmarks as luggage tags. That would be pretty neat too. But sometimes just one of those little things, not having the right supply on hand that you really want to finish a project, can hold me up. So this was an entire process over an entire week that this sat on my table as I was working through it. So with the key fob, this is something I did previously and I taught with the Silhouette Curio. So I had these screw rivets on hand. It is what I would recommend for anybody. They'll be linked in the description below. If you do not have a rivet setter, which is what is typically used with most leather projects when you're adding things like the key rings. Setting rivets is a whole technique in itself, and if you get cheap rivets, you're just going to end up cussing. Believe me, I've been there. So if you're going to get rivets, you need to get some good quality ones, and I will show that here in just a second. But I'm just using a screw rivet, which I really find is very easy, and I'm trying to decide which way it's going to go. Front, side. It does have like a screw head on it, so it does affect the look of it. And then I grabbed additional tools, so you can see me taking it apart here. That one with the E with the monogram is one I did on the Silhouette Curio. So I was comparing the 2 designs. Now, to really compare it, you would want to do the exact same design and the exact same stain. But it's pretty good. I'm very impressed with the quality of the tooling and deboss with the Siser machines. The biggest factor is going to be that thickness, but playing around with it and testing is your best way. So with these keychains, it is a kit that I got on Amazon, and it came with rivets. So I grabbed my rivet setter. You want to protect your workspace because you are pounding on a metal surface. And I grabbed those to test them out and see how I was going to do that. So my first one, I actually messed up. I ended up having to, use my leather punch to cut bigger holes for the rivets that came with the leather keychains. So know that right away. You may have to make those holes bigger. And then I actually did this rivet. Now rivets are difficult to get the hang of to set it. It is a technique. And then I forgot to put the key ring on. So it's a good thing that those are split rings and can just be added on after the fact too. So I just continued to do that and finish out those. I actually liked the smaller rings that I had in my supplies better with these smaller keychains. The bigger key rings that came with it were, in my opinion, too large for what I wanted to do. But keep in mind when you're doing your designs, the hardware that you're going to be applying to that. You might want to put one, dry fit it together to see what your spacing is before you measure. I did not do that in advance. And like my A and some of my S's are, the E you can see there is a little bit close, but you know, I'm not going to redo them. They're just fine in my opinion for me being able to give these to my family and friends. So I'm just going to continue doing that, and it still does a much better job than I would do by hand tooling on leather. So I just continued to make all those and finish out the process. And then set them up for a finalized photo. And I tested quite a bit. I still have a list of products that I want to test and projects that I want to do. Once I get started with it, it is really hard to stop. So here is a look at some of the finished projects. The key fob, the adventure bookmark. I used the Siser EasyCrease tool with Juliet, but it will work with Siser Romeo as well. And then here's a couple of those key tags up close. And all of the projects at the finish that I completed. Now, I knew someone would ask about processed leather, so I wanted to test that as well. Processed leather can be very more difficult to work with. One, it doesn't really cut well on any cutting machine because it just kind of smooshes, and it will depend on the quality of your leather as well. Garment leather or craft leather that you find in a craft store is not real high quality leather. This is a remnant from Tandy leather that we picked up in a packet. Like I said, we have a ton of supplies for leather working. So I'm just testing it, and I want to share the finished results with that test. It can be more difficult, and you aren't going to get the same results as if you are using tooling leather. So first I just tested an outline. I'll give a close-up look here in just a second. And then I wanted to test with a fill. And again, I tested with a higher force as well. So this is on processed leather, and I'll have to test more. It's really hard to see. Of course, it's black, so you're not going to see much. But it doesn't, because of the texture of the leather, it just has a different look to it once it's embossed. Let's see if I can get it to focus here. Maybe just an outline. I did try an outline down here. That was force of 60, which didn't hardly even break the surface. Processed leather is just tougher because it's been treated, and all leather is going to vary. So testing really is the only way to know. There are so many different types of leather. But in this case, this one, I wouldn't even attempt to cut because I know it's just going to do a terrible job anyhow. So you would be hand cutting whatever design that you are working with anyhow. So I'll just get closer in here. And this is with the same fill as I used on this tooling leather. So you can see there's quite a bit of difference, and that processing and the texture of the leather in general affects the outcome. So I did one more test, and this is the one with the fill where you can see that texture. This here, I just tried the outline, and this is a force of 160. So you could possibly get some decent results with it. You don't really want to break the surface. I can see it kind of pulling, it's focused on my finger now, pulling on the tension of the actual leather. You can see kind of where it's, I guess I'd call it zippering. It's kind of the same effect as the laminate and zippering if you try to cut through too many layers at one time. So you could probably play around with this and do several passes with a force setting, but your leather is just going to vary. All leather is going to vary. Here's a still shot of that processed leather. It is not great in my opinion. Of course, smooth leather might be a little bit different than textured leather. So I hope those tips have helped. Here's a look at those finished projects. I am loving this and I can't wait to test more and more projects on the way. Make sure to like, subscribe, click that bell for notifications, and I would love to hear if you try this out. Thanks for joining me and have a great day.